Hello, Mudasir. How are you?
Hi, Sai. I'm good. How about you?
I am likewise, my friend. We have a very, very special, unique, and quite brilliant guest today, as we do.
Yes, and I'm very much looking forward to interact with Constantine.
Excellent, excellent. Do you want to give a quick introduction of yourself, Mudasir, and I'll do the same, and we'll set the stage.
Yeah, certainly. Hi there. I'm Mudassir. I am a leadership and transformation coach. I work with teams and leaders to identify the opportunities and challenges in helping everyone to operate at their best levels.
Excellent. Excellent. And I'm Sai, as I mentioned, I focus on transformation and change and working with businesses of all scales and sizes, if you will, to really partner and help them calibrate their business models and operating models. The pillars I dip into, and I'm sure we're going to span these, if you will, business, strategy, leadership, culture, execution, and technology, really for impact and helping those clients make an impact. As we talk with Constantine, especially today, my focus a lot of times is the sacred triad, as I call it: reality, human nature, and identity, to help clients become, if you will, enlivened even further to achieve their impact. And before we invite Constantine into the conversation, just a little bit of background, and by no stretch will this do him justice in the breadth and depth that he gets into. A professor
Mhm.
of philosophy, if you will, is very, very key. The founding director of Lex Academic, which we'll definitely want to explore and learn more about. Likewise, he is very much tied into the philosophy of action, moral psychology, and interpersonal understanding, and the psychology of philosophy at large, if you will. So a lot of brilliant areas to really move forward with. I'm sure we'll briefly mention, if you will, the five philosophical felines and the cynic. My daughter loves Hugo Boss, baby, as I've already mentioned to Constantine already. So his work spans many, many spectrums. And I mentioned to Constantine, I actually learned more about him initially in 2008. One of the pieces he wrote was How to Act Against Your Better Judgment, a very, very powerful piece, if you will. A little bit more before I invite this fine gentleman in. People say, why philosophy? Why Constantine? Why did you hone in on this gentleman? Particularly, the perspective that philosophy gives us in a very practical sense can be very, very powerful. And I feel it's under tapped. So we need Constantine's voice. The silver
Mhm.
rule that he's written about, leadership and ethics and asymmetry that he's written about, truly profound work that I have used practically, quite honestly, with almost every leader that I've worked with. So, Constantine, whether you know it or not, you've touched my good friend, all the folks I've worked with over the years. Welcome, Constantine.
Thank you so much. It's very kind. Nice to meet you both. Hi, Sai. Hi, Mudafir.
Hi,
A
It's
Constantine.
pleasure.
great to
Welcome.
be here.
A pleasure. So, my good friend, we'd love to start off with just the main question that kicks us all off, if you will. Who is Constantine Sandis, if you will?
I don't know. I've got no idea, to be honest, but here I am. I guess it's me if I refers, which is possibly doubtful. Um, I was born in New Delhi. My dad was a diplomat. He was posted in India at the time. And I kind of grew up all around different countries, all around the world, and ended up in the UK for my studies, really. So I came here as an undergraduate. I really wanted to study something called PPP, which is philosophy, psychology, and physiology. But I was a kind of an sort of literature student in school, and you needed math for the statistics for psychology. So I had to switch to. I wanted to do philosophy. You can't do it on its own in Oxford. I had to switch to philosophy and theology, and then eventually when I got into graduate studies, the philosophy took over. But I've been very interested both in philosophy of psychology, which is when you look at kind of questions about human action and its motivation and the reasons for which we act from a kind of philosophical perspective, and not merely, I don't mean this in a bad way, but not just a psychological perspective. But I'm equally interested in something less popular, which is the psychology of philosophy. I guess the godfather of that is kind of Nietzsche, or maybe Hume before him. And the psychology of philosophy is really when you think about why do philosophers um, argue or think a certain way, and they like to think it's all pure kind of reason and following the argument wherever it goes. But you can see patterns of maybe philosophers of different faith will have great arguments for very different things, but where has that come from? So I'm interested in the kind of psychology behind our philosophizing as well as the other way around, if that makes sense. So yeah, I'm for now a philosophy professor, that we can come back to that. So I'm not the founding director of Lex Academic. In fact, it was really co-founded with my wife, who is the boss and CEO. So we'll get to that. If I give examples of good leadership, it will be her and not me. Lex Academic is really, it's our second anniversary on November 1st. So it's a very young company, and really set up to help academics with a range of things. First and foremost, it was to help people with excellent research who, for one reason or another, need to write in English, but maybe English isn't their first language, so they're reasonably proficient, but there's a lot of bias in academic journals and refereeing, and something can be knocked back because of kind of a figure of speech that's not quite right or something. So we help sort of non-native, if you will, academics with editing, copy editing, and so on. So we've got a range of kind of author services, but they're really by researchers for researchers. So we sort of get specialists in the right field to work on the things, because a lot of kind of generic editing doesn't really understand the technical concepts, and a lot of mistakes can happen. I don't know if you've had a book go through copy editing, all sorts of things can go wrong if the person. So we're really kind of a sort of academic focused company, but we also do increasingly consulting on career, publication, book proposals, and so on. So it began as an editing company, but we do a lot of other things right now. So and it's not just philosophy, though we do have a strength in philosophy, of course.
Definitely. Would you like to ask a question, or should I jump into a few items, my good friend?
Yeah, let me ask a question. So this may be a bit controversial. So nonetheless, let me put it out there. Philosophy is easy subject, or studying philosophy is easy until you study it. Okay, it's a popular belief versus reality, right? That being said, and then you call yourself as a philosopher and a founder of Lex Academic, and how do you see your role, or how do you explain your journey as a philosopher?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Not that controversial. I mean, I oddly, in school, I found it very hard to kind of. I wasn't the kind of student who could memorize things, so I found things like history quite hard because of all the dates and so on. And I thought, oh, philosophy, this will be easy because it's all about, you think through things, but you don't need to learn all this stuff. And of course, I was completely wrong. And you start studying, and then of course you can't just enter into a kind of vacuum of ideas with your own thoughts. And for my sins, I ended up doing quite a lot of history of philosophy, early modern philosophy, and then later kind of early 20th century analytic philosophy. And you have to even start getting a grasp of dates and timelines and people and ideas and concepts. So yeah, it gets a lot harder, and it can be disappointing for some people, because I think you also start with quite big ideas, and then the more you read, the more you can end up kind of stuck in a very small technical debate or something like that. And the real difficulty is to get out of that and somehow come back to the big ideas, but having learned something, you have to do the small technical stuff, like the how to act against your better judgment, which has kind of deontic logic and quite tech. And you have to do that but only to come out and then sort of be more accessible again. I think so. So my journey was definitely one of kind of learning that philosophy is hard, but also more recently learning that it's hard, but it doesn't need to be hard to read. You know, it can be done. Philosophers aren't great at this, but I'm trying. Does that answer? I think I may have missed a bit of your question.
No,
I
no, no,
don't know.
certainly, yeah,
Yeah.
certainly that did set a good stage
Oh,
on
one more thing. I mean, you say, I'm a philosopher, and this is I it's a bit like someone saying I'm a poet. It's a very weird thing to say. So for years, I used to say I teach philosophy. I'm a teacher of
Mhm.
philosophy. But I've been on research leave for 3 years or more, so I haven't been teaching philosophy. I have some PhDs, so I can't really say that in good faith. And I'm actually this is not really public news, but I am leaving my university post. I'll stay on in a kind of honorary role. I'm very happy with my department and my university, and we have a good relationship. But I'm moving to kind of lex academic and more public philosophy, and you can't do everything. So that aspect of things is winding down.
Nice, nice, thank you.
Excellent. Constantine, would love to kind of hear if you're good, really sharing sort of your perspective on kind of risk taking, just sort of the big picture, risk taking and leadership and skin in the game and what have you, just to kind of set the stage for even deeper conversation here.
Yeah, so risk taking. I mean, it's become. I mean, it's very important, of course, to think about these things. It's become kind of. I mean, fashionable is the wrong word. It sounds a bit mean. But people are talking about it and thinking about it a lot more than say 20 years ago. And I think even though we've had the Great Depression in the past and so on, I think some of the more recent financial crises have really kind of sparked interest in risk taking. I think in the past we were kind of more interested in risk taking as something kind of on the one hand, and this is still very important, of course, but maybe to do with prudence in one's own life, not driving while drunk and kind of things like that, and maybe kind of private investment and shares and taking risks and how to handle one's money if one's lucky enough to have money to handle. And I think these days, first of all, we've got kind of climate emergency and very big questions to do with that. So there's kind of, precaution there takes, it's radically different from these kind of everyday things, even if there are some kind of lessons in common. And of course, these big crises that have happened and keep happening again. And even things like, tough decisions on, what to do with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and how does one, those kind of big kind of, and I think the more we live in a connected global world, the more complex these kind of questions become. But ultimately, risk taking is really, for me, a subset of epistemology or theory of knowledge. So there's a kind of wider field, which is not everything in it might be of direct interest to people interested in risk taking. And it includes questions of trust, but also, can I trust myself, my own senses? So it begins with very big philosophical questions where, if you're in banking or something, you might think, look, I don't care about, is this a book or some, how do I know this is a book? You might think, leave that to the philosophers. But those kind of questions, especially the way the ancients asked them and the way they thought about these questions about when to follow one's beliefs, when to follow one's desires, and the psychology is coming in there. This is really the start for me of philosophical thinking about risk, because uncertainty is all around us, and acting under uncertainty is not something that's tied to gambling or the markets or the environment. It's something that's kind of everywhere. So risk taking in that sense comes back to something that's quite everyday. It's just the stakes are really high in the kind of world we live in, where people have nuclear weapons and things, right? Which was not the case when the ancient skeptics were writing, for example. I've not offered a view on risk taking.
Yeah.
This will come out down the line, but I'm giving you a perspective of how I think it fits within kind of broader philosophical thought about what can I know, what can I learn from past knowledge, how certain can I be that the future will resemble the past, and those kind of questions.
Excellent, Constantine. And do you feel like, especially in the pace that we exert ourselves today, are we overlooking, if you will, that bigger spectrum by sort of micro focusing on risk taking or being risk savvy or whatever terminology that we might apply to it?
I think so. And I think one thing that gets lost, for example, is this connection between theory of knowledge and philosophy of science. We don't normally, of course, if you're an engineer, risk-taking and science are very, very close. But when you're thinking of businesses and finance, people might say it's a kind of science, but you don't think of scientific experiments. And what's interesting, I work on a philosopher called David Hume, and he was the one who's kind of famous for the problem of induction. And what's interesting there is the kind of risk-taking of, why is it that, if I put my hand in the fire and I get burned the first time or something, why is it that I don't do it again? And how do we explain this? And this is where the psychology of philosophy comes in. It's very tempting to think, oh, well, it's very rational not to do this. But of course, how do I know that it will hurt me again? And looking at how the history of ideas, how people have dealt with kind of the early stages of scientific progress and experimentation, I think we can learn a lot from that, which is way more robust than any kind of financial thinking or indeed kind of predictions about, these books that come out in magazines, predictions for sport or whatever, which is really nowhere near as robust as kind of the history of chemistry or something.
Yeah. And forgive me for not mentioning earlier in our introduction, I have a little bit of background in philosophy, if you will, and definitely have published and have said, so the work you're doing resonates very, very deeply, if you will. Like I said, not only practically as I work with clients, but just historically. The question that comes to mind is, as you look at that breadth and depth, sort of what are maybe the top three things that you think that we ought to consider as we look at the world and act within the world that we find ourselves in today?
So I've talked a lot so far about prudence, prudential stuff, and I think that this is one of them. But the other big one is really ethics, which I haven't mentioned so far. Of course, ethics and prudence aren't completely removed, but where we're not so concerned with our own fate necessarily, but that of others when we take risk. And I think a lot of discussions about risk taking are about how not to lose one's money or how not to have an accident, and some of it might be kind of in between the self and the others. I think there's the kind of, so in philosophy we talk of others and other others. So there's the sort of a lot of the kind of climate emergency stuff. It's about others, but it's framed in our children or something like that. So it's still kind of prudential, kind of selfish, not ultra selfish. You might sacrifice something yourself for other people who you're very tightly connected to. But then there's kind of others who are effectively strangers, and they enter the kind of ethical realm as well, and where someone might be very hardline and be like, this is business. Why should I care about it? The famous kind of, there's a cartoon I really like where there's these two men sitting in a bar, and one of them says, "But John, this isn't ethics. This is business ethics." Mm-hmm. As if This isn't real ethics. We're just kind of ticking boxes here or something. So I'm kind of interested in finding ways to bring ethics and business kind of questions together in relation to risk taking. And that's very hard because when you study ethics, you learn these kind of normative or moral theories, if you like, consequentialism, deontology, virtue ethics. And then it's very tempting to take these and look at a business scenario and just plug one of them in and kind of see what comes out, through the kind of mincer. And what that fails to do is to kind of start from the questions of the kind of work environment or the kind of whatever it is you're looking at and the domain of the risk. And you can't just bring in a theory and just kind of see what happens. So I'm very interested in looking at things from the inside. So while philosophy is very important and that wider picture is very important, it can also be, philosophers can be a bit too arrogant and pleased with their subject, and it's like we've got all the answers and now we come in and if you look at my theory and you apply it. So I don't really like the word applied philosophy because it looks like you do all the philosophy and then you just come in and you say, right, tell me your domain and I'll apply it to risk taking. And I think that it doesn't really work that way. You need to know things from the inside, and that's hard, and it's very hard to maybe it requires teams of people rather than individuals. It's very hard to get that knowledge that's required that covers both this kind of wider theoretical stuff and the kind of domain-based specific skills and knowledge required.
Excellent.
Okay. So, Sai, if I may can chime in. So, Constantine, you did talk about business ethics versus ethics, right? So that's a very, very common topic. How do you approach to bring them together, or to say these are one and the same?
Yeah, so I really think that distinction is very dangerous, which is why I brought it up, the business ethics distinction, because it makes it sound like well, it can mean two things really, business ethics. It can either mean nudge, nudge, wink, wink, this isn't really ethics at all, we're just trying to get approval, which happens, but is really not good, and is not ethical. And that brings us to kind of genuine ethics. But even there, I want that distinction. Genuine business ethics for me can't be applying ethics to business, even if you're now doing it in earnest. So you're not just ticking boxes, you really are trying to find the best moral theory and then apply it to a business environment. I think that still misses what I was saying before. You're taking something external and you're applying it in a place without kind of thinking if this was kind of a good fit and built for that. And what I'm interested in is in a way testing those ethical theories through these other kind of scenarios and refining them in response to what happens, not in a kind of cynical way of hey, if it doesn't work for us, we dismiss it, but in a kind of way where you think, when these theories were developed, a lot of them were developed, for example, with war in mind, questions of just war, and so they might be particularly good when applied to questions of self-defense, and when it's okay to use violence, and when, if ever, and when it's not okay, and so on. But they might not work that well in a kind of complex environment in a large company that's losing money, and there's a question of, do people need to be laid off, and how should this be done, and so on. But I do think the field is one and the same. And we should be doing more bottom up ethics rather than top down. So not just starting with the theory and applying it, but looking at these kind of scenarios. Now that said, some of the stuff I've written doesn't quite do this. I'm guilty as any philosopher. I don't think I go as far as because we can talk about this later. I'm kind of, if I'm anything in ethics, it's what's called moral particularism, which doesn't quite believe in universal principles. So I'm less likely than other philosophers to simply apply things. And despite that, of course, I have come up with kind of rules of thumb and constraints and so on. But what I was interested in is things that cut across all moral theories. So in a way, it doesn't really matter if you're more consequentialist or deontologist. We can leave this stuff aside and think everyone should agree that these kind of things are not correct ways to behave, either prudentially or ethically. And that's, I guess, related to some of the skin in the game stuff.
Yeah. Constantine and Musa, if you're good, I'll jump in and ask a question likewise to kind of build on the conversation.
And you can also object to me if what I say sounds wrong. I'm very open to. I like a little argument.
Most definitely. Constantine, you bring up two things that really sort of strike me as very important. One is some distinctions are dangerous, if you will. So not all distinctions. I mean, we really hurt ourselves, quite honestly, in many ways by making distinctions that we shouldn't be making. Very much in the vein that you shared. Additionally, if we reference, if you will, I'll say Aristotle, the chicken egg sort of dilemma. To your point, practice theory, which comes first? Do they come together, etc.? I think a lot of people should take a refreshing view listening to you, saying it isn't just go think about theory and then applying the theory in a particular context, but use the scenarios to learn, if you will, in the specifics.
So I'm very keen on a kind of paraphrase, kind of stealing something from Kant and rephrasing it for this purpose, which is that theory without a practice is empty, and practice without theory is blind. So these two things. One thing I was very interested in before I got into risk taking was the incredibly complex issue of heritage ethics, which has actually really changed since I was working on it with cultural appropriation and all sorts of other things. But there, when you talk with practitioners and then you talk with people doing theory, and both are right from their sides, but it's very hard to go and apply the theory if you don't understand archaeology, for example. If you don't understand how art preservation works. But likewise, it doesn't mean that the people on the ground or the museum curators might be the best people to grasp wider ethical implications. So that's where I first actually, before this other stuff, got interested in that thought that you can't just do the ethics and come in and decide where every statue should be or something like that. But nor can it just be left to people who have had no philosophical thinking whatsoever.
Yeah. And this is one thing definitively I know Mudasir and I have championed is really it's an and, it's not an or. And and that's very key. And as I like to say, you're essentially doing both simultaneously, and just you're thinking theory and you're practicing at the same time. And there's a delicate balance and almost dance between them.
It's a tough balance. It's why I sometimes like collaborators. I think while there are a lot of things I write on my own, and there's this kind of vision of the philosopher as someone alone in a study. I mean, I'm never alone. I've got all these animals around me. This is kind of the most peaceful I've been all year. But sometimes you've got to collaborate, and sometimes collaborations work extremely well because you get that kind of correct combination. And other times they really fail, and this is part of what I'm interested in is kind of, you mentioned earlier, is kind of interpersonal understanding. And you can learn a lot even when they fail, but because you can learn a lot about that failure to come together and communicate when you think two people can do something. And, you have this knowledge, I have this background, let's get together and work on this. And even when it fails, you can learn a lot from it. But I do think sometimes you need, whether it's two people or bigger teams, you do need that collaborative thought. Of course, it's got its limits. You're trying to publish a paper with 5 people and you can't all agree on something. It's got its issues as well, of course.
Most definitely. Kind of pulling it back, Constantine, to the leadership and definitively sort of the lessons that you've learned in your journey and working respectfully with your wife and the lessons that she's learned. We'd love kind of your perspective on leadership and sort of guidance that you could offer any leader in any organization that may be worthwhile to take in.
So like I said, she's the real boss. She's the leader. Apart from our cat Hugo Boss Baby, who's the kind of mega boss who really makes the decisions around here. I don't know. He's not around right now. But one thing we've been learning a lot, kind of on the ground, very very fast. And one thing we've learned is and this is not my philosophy. It's not novel to me or anything. It's things I've learned from looking at other people and reading other people's books. But fail fast and fail small. So we're into experimenting.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't go all in. You experiment with very little time or very little money, and you see what happens, and then you see whether you want to carry on. So it's quite risk averse in this way, but you do have to take those small risks. You can't just sit and say, well, I know this worked, so I'm not going to try anything else. And sometimes you don't fail, and sometimes that little thing you tried really does work. And again, when it works, that doesn't mean you go all in. You sort of try a little more. You change a variable because it might not work. And this is the kind of philosophy of psychology or philosophy stuff. It might not work for the reason you think it works. I think a lot of psychology actually has the right views about human beings, but for the wrong reasons. So they get things and they work, but the explanation of why they work might not be what they think it is. And that's incredibly hard to know why something actually worked with all the variables in the world. So of course we've had many little failures. You can call them. There's a big debate on the difference between errors and mistakes and misjudgments. And you've got to do these things, but you've got to do them in a fairly risk averse manner. Move on. Ultimately, of course, you don't do anything that threatens the core, and you kind of add things to that, and if it works, you kind of grow them. Now that is the potential side. The ethical side, it's very easy for me to talk about the ethical side right now because we run a very small company. It's a lot easier to run a small company ethically than it is a big company. That I'm not saying I wouldn't run a big company ethically, but anyone can say, oh, if I had a huge company, I would. And there you do enter kind of levels of knowledge of how to even know what is happening under your name and so on. I'm generally not a fan of huge companies for this reason. So I'm not trying to defend huge companies by saying, oh, it's not their fault. No one acted unethically. It's just so big that these things happen. Being small actually helps a company to be ethical. Of course, every company, this is human nature, which you spoke about earlier. Every company wants to grow. Every company wants to get bigger, and we want to grow. We're getting bigger, but we're growing slow. One thing we've learned is growing fast is not necessarily good. It may feel good for a while, but you pay the price later. So kind of small growth is small and steady growth is much better. It's more robust. We do try and be anti-fragile, and I can talk about this as well in a moment. And there's a question of, must you grow at all costs always? To which I think the answer is no. Right. And that can be, again, for prudential work-life balance reasons, but also for kind of other ethical reasons. So growth at all costs is not necessarily a good thing.
Nice, nice. So, great. So, thanks, Constantine. And this is huge, and this is heavy. You talked about collaborators. You talked about uh, getting it right. You talked about fail fast, fail often, and then small and steady growth, risk averse, and then not taking the risks that impact the core. So, if I put all things into perspective, in any team, it can be related to IT or non-IT, there is a tendency of getting it right sooner in first time or second time. Get it right versus fail fast and fail often. And how do you help people to embrace fail fast, fail often, or how, that is first question. And second question is, what are any practical advice or guidance to find a balance between these two?
Yeah, that's not just a good question, right? It's a very difficult question. So I don't know if I'm going to be able to kind of answer it perfectly, because if I had that answer, it's a very tough question. But I will give you my thoughts on it
Sure,
nonetheless, and
please.
you can tell me if so I mean, to kind of try and rephrase it, that there's the thought of, look, it's easy to say fail fast, fail often, but what if I just keep failing? How is that?
Mhm.
Even if it's loads of small little failures, what's the point? On the other hand, it's very easy to say never fail, always get things right, don't but the uncertainty is like, you don't know if you're going to fail or not, and it's very easy to say don't act unless you know for certain. Now
Mhm.
you can't do that, so the risk aversion has to come in, not at the don't act level, but at the level of how much are you risking when you act. And of course, importantly, in any company, even a small one, um, what are you risking? Am I, if I'm losing something and I'm happy with this, I take that risk. But am I risking someone else's job? Am I risking someone else's money? That becomes more. That's where the ethics comes in, and it's not as simple. If I want to take a kind of personal risk and I've decided I can afford it and I know what that risk is, I can maybe take a bigger risk if it affects other people. But of course, to come back to this balance, one thing you've got to learn is to know when to stop and to know when to get out. And I think too many kind of people, whether it's in daily life, relationships, um, um, romantic or otherwise, business, education, fall for the kind of sunk cost fallacy. It's this, well, I've invested this much time, energy, emotion, money, whatever into this, so I'm
Mhm.
not going to back off now. I mean, there's people who have third children for this reason, to try and sort of save a marriage or something. So this kind of sunk cost fallacy, it is where, it's not just keep failing. It's knowing when to stop, and knowing whether, am I going to stop and try something different, or am I going to stop and think, hey, maybe Constantine, maybe you're not cut out for business, maybe you're not cut out for philosophy, maybe you're not, whatever it is, and learning that lesson. And if you fail kind of small and fast, then you can back out without too many sunk costs, um, and have enough reserve. And I'm not talking money here necessarily, but energy, emotion, whatever, to go into something else. And that's incredibly hard, because when you've invested in something emotionally more than anything else, it can be really hard to sort of back away
Mhm.
from it. I'll give you one example. I can't give you all the details, but within Lex, we had a time when I had this, what I thought was this great idea, and we were going to do this thing. And I spent so much time on it, so much time on it. And I really kind of perfected this. I can't tell you all the details. I perfected this thing we were going to do. And I was talking with Louise about it, and she was in agreement. That Louise is my wife and the CEO of Lex. And we were kind of, on the same page, even with our shareholder Peter. We were all on the same kind of page. But this was my idea and my baby, and I was putting all the work. It involved other people external to the company. I was building this huge thing, and really, pretty much the day I had, the first kind of draft of the whole thing, Louise came up with an objection which neither she nor I had kind of thought of before, and she was like, "But what about this? What if this happened?" And she was completely right. And the only thing to do, it was very painful, but the only thing to do, it was not to try and it was just to abandon it. And like that. And this was literally on the night when I was, presenting the final work after months and that was the thing to do. And I've not looked back, and it's done. And okay, I lost some months, but if I persevered because, but you put all this work in and you blah blah blah, it could have been really disastrous in some way. Sorry, I've had to keep it a bit vague, but
it was good and then well said. Yeah, uh, only constant thing is uncertainty. So that's the crux of your message. And yeah, thanks for your insight. Sai, do you have anything to ask, or please go ahead?
Yeah, Constantine, I would love for you to comment. That's a great example. There's and I'm going to use a very particular word, so please feel free to change it if you will. There's a real confrontation and embracing of our ego when we have to let go of something we've put our heart and soul into. And it takes a lot of wisdom, and you could change that word as well. I think it takes a lot of wisdom to be able to do that.
You need, I'm not going to sit here and say I was cool, calm, and collected and wise.
No.
It was painful. It was painful. I'm a stubborn, this is one of my bad character traits. I'm quite stubborn by nature. So I was stubborn, for a few minutes, maybe an hour, but we didn't do it. And I decided not to do it. And yeah, it wasn't easy. But again, it's not like, oh yes, I see reasons, and then you just follow them, and it's all nice and clear. It's this very hard thing to do, and of course, uncertainty is all around. I consider and say, who knows? Maybe it would have been the best thing we'd ever done. But she was right, because it's not just that uncertain; it's that chances were high. This might not have been a good thing, and we hadn't thought of certain things and so on. And this has happened. In fact, I would say. So one time was this with my idea, and another time was a more collective idea that we had, which we abandoned, not quite as late stage as this, but certainly, we'd done a lot of kind of market research and things, and again, that always leaves this kind of, I sometimes suffer from fear of missing out, so it leaves this. What if we had done this? What if we, and sometimes, in the cases where you can test it with just a bit, and this was the point, this was something where I had failed to test it with just a bit, because I was so sure there was no negative side to this, right? So yeah, it takes, I don't, a kind of, it takes a kind of humility, but you've got to, I was stubborn. It's not like I was, but you've just got to fight that.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely, we're all human. Exactly to that point. We're all human, and dealing with uncertainty in a very, very deliberate way. It takes a lot of discipline, awareness, and many, many other factors. I've got one more question, if you don't mind, how do you, because that's a perfect, how do we help others, if you will, sort of approach that degree of uncertainty that's all around us in the way that you described? What can we do to improve?
Oh gosh, as a particularist, I think help to other people may be very different for different people in different situations. So I don't know if I have a blanket kind of solution to that. I generally think kind of um, big big talk advice on these kind of things is something I'm sort of almost ethically against. Think of the skin in the game stuff. If I sit here and say, do this with your time and this with your money, and then someone goes and does it and suffers all sorts of misfortune, and I'm logged out playing with Hugo Boss Baby, and okay, and I say, oh well, look, I was just speaking on DX Constructed, great show, but don't blame me. So I'm very wary of kind of giving this kind of advice where I'm not sticking my neck out in a kind of genuine way. It's very easy for people to go online, on the blog, on Twitter, on YouTube, and spit out kind of advice of this kind. So I hope it doesn't feel like a cheap show, but I'm very nervous about this kind of thing. That said,
but you've demonstrated, if you don't mind, I'd interrupt you just for a minute. You've demonstrated a very key point. Exactly the reason I asked the question, my good man, because we shouldn't generalize to that degree.
You were testing me.
With all due respect, sir, but beautifully expressed though on your part.
It's kind of it's very tempting to want to offer advice of this kind, So the only advice I can offer really is this kind of, and I'm happy to be blamed if some, it is to read a lot, read the stuff, and don't just read in your field. The most interesting stuff is stuff that's coming from another field that may be applicable to yours. It might have to be distorted in some way. It might not fit, perfectly like a jigsaw. But what can go wrong? Actually, I was reading something today. Someone said their counselor told them they'd be much happier if they stopped reading philosophy, and they stopped reading and they were much happier. So maybe there are exceptions, but generally speaking, I would say don't be afraid of doing the hard work. And I think in our age, it's very tempting to want to go to people. There are companies who distill the essences of books for people who are too busy. You're not going to get it. Half the point is what you need, what you need to go through to get that kind of essence on your own. You can't just, of course, I'm not saying finish every book you read from cover to cover, but you've got to do that hard work and that hard thinking for yourself. You've got to put yourself in the situations. And I say reading, for other people, they prefer, it could be YouTube lectures, it could be interviews, it could be conferences. I mean, some people, I'm very much someone who likes to read, but Louise, for example, is much keener on podcasts, and it's just as good. It all depends on what you're reading and what you're listening to. So whatever it is, but you've got to really make the time for that properly and hear different opinions, not just Constantine, for example. Yeah.
Excellent. Anything else, Mauricio, from yourself before we close out, my good friend?
No, nothing specific, and then we will take a closing thoughts, and then we spent good time, and we got great wisdom for Constantine, for us, and our audience.
Definitely.
I'm sorry, Hugo Boss Baby didn't make an appearance. No. You'll have to book him in separately on his own, I think.
There you go. A closing thoughts, Constantine, for our audience, my good friend. Anything at all you'd like to share before we close out for the event?
I don't really have a closing thought. I had more of a kind of maybe question for Sasai and Mudassir, which is, because you obviously know your own audience much better than I do, and if there's something that you think they're interested in that we haven't addressed, or if I've been too focused on a certain way of certain aspects of of the themes we're discussing and neglecting others, I'd be very happy to sort of speak to other things. It's hard for me to know what people are, expecting to get out of something like this. So I'm very happy to do that if you want, but I don't have a big closing thought. It's been a great pleasure talking with you both, of course.
Likewise. Mood, is there anything from you that you'd like to call out, or I can contribute sort of a closing thought? Likewise.
So, quick
Yeah.
call out from my side is this is more or less a food for thought for me and then some of our audiences is uh, ethics versus business ethics, and then that gets into the meta ethics and moral particularism, all that stuff to explore more and then to understand the distinction and also why that distinction is there, and then how can we leverage for greater good in the sense. And while talking about this, you talked about war and conflict as well as talking in terms of monetary stuff. So understanding that is much more important task, uh, and that is a good call out, Constantine. Thank you.
Thanks.
Excellent. And definitely, I think, Constantine, you demonstrated something which was extremely key in our conversation. Not only we talked about prudence and imprudence in a sense, if you will, or ethics and if you will, unethical behavior or what have you, but the distinction factor is a big one. And additionally, you truly demonstrated skin in the game by not giving sort of a general advice, if you will. So truly, this is one of the key reasons, as I like when we started, one of the key reasons I focus on your work, amongst others, by all means, but you provide perspective. So, dear sir, thank you for all the contributions you make in the world.
Too kind, Sai. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking with you both.
Thank you so much. And by all means, I hope you'll come and visit again, especially as Lex Academic continues the journey and the things that we learn all along the way.
My pleasure, of course.
Thank
Anytime.
you. Thank you. Please give our best to everyone on your end, especially Louise, your wife, of course, by all means, and Hugo Boss. Hugo Boss baby, to be proper, one would not forget. So thank you so much.
HBB. There's another 4 cats, and there's a dog I'll probably have to go walk in a moment.
There we go. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us. And we look forward to our next conversation. Thank you again.
Thank you again.
Bye-bye.